Peter was the spokesman for the disciples. He was one of the disciples chosen by Jesus. What I want to do today is give you a brief history of Peter. These are some of the references I read to get information on Peter. Peter was a disciple, and we all remember all the other 12 disciples. Peter, Andrew, James, and John are the 4 we're going to talk about today. Peter was from Bethsaida. If you look on the map, the Bethsaida is the very top of the Sea of Galilee. But by the time they met Jesus, they had moved to Capernaum. Now look where Capernaum is. Capernaum is just to the left and down just a little bit from Bethsaida. Peter's father's name was Jonah, and his brother, who also became a disciple, was Andrew. Andrew was a follower of John the Baptist, and Andrew told his brother Simon about Jesus. Remember, John the Baptist said that Jesus was the Messiah? Peter's name was Simon before he met Jesus. Jesus gave him the name Peter, and that's another lesson for later. He is often called by both names, Simon Peter. Luke 5:8 says, when Simon Peter saw this, he fell at Jesus' knees and said, "Go away from me, Lord, I am a sinful man." Now, this is a verse we're going to use later today, but it does use both names, Simon Peter. Simon Peter and the rest of the disciples were not trained in Jewish law or Mosaic law. They did not go to school to become leaders in the synagogue, which is probably why Jesus wanted them. Simon Peter and Andrew may have been fishing partners with James and John, the sons of Zebedee. James and John, remember, also became disciples of Jesus. More information on Simon Peter: he was probably married, because Matthew 8, verses 14-15 say Jesus went to Peter's house. There he saw Peter's mother-in-law was in bed with a high fever. Jesus touched her hand, and the fever left her. Then she stood and began to serve Jesus. Nothing else was said about Peter's wife or about having any children. Simon Peter, Andrew, and their father were fishermen. That was a rough life back then. They were taxed heavily by the Romans, and it was very hard to make a living as a fisherman. But when Simon and Andrew met Jesus, they were living in Capernaum. Remember where Capernaum was? Jesus stayed in Simon Peter's house when he was in Capernaum. There is an octagonal Christian church on the site where Christian tradition says Peter's house was located. Much of what we know about Simon Peter comes from the New Testament, but there's a lot that comes from Christian tradition, which is simply things that people said after Simon Peter was alive about Simon Peter. And it was taken up as part of the Christian faith. I will use Luke 5 to talk about Jesus meeting Simon Peter. Jesus was from Nazareth. Now, if you look at the map, you can find the Sea of Galilee. Go left and down a little bit, you'll find Nazareth. It was about 20 miles from Capernaum. And Simon Peter, remember, lived in Capernaum. Now, this shows one of the paths that Jesus took as he was teaching in the Galilee. And notice he goes way up, down, up and around, back to Capernaum, and then heads to Jerusalem. So this is a map of a route of one of Jesus's trips. And this story comes from Luke chapter 5, verses 1 through 11. It says, one day Jesus was standing beside Lake Galilee. Many people were pressing all around him. They wanted to hear the word of God. There was no room. Jesus saw 2 boats at the shore of the lake. The fishermen had left them and were washing their nets. Jesus got into one of the boats, the one that belonged to Simon. Jesus asked Simon to push off a little from the land. Then Jesus sat down in the boat and continued to teach people on the shore so they could. Can you imagine being there with Jesus teaching and you could see him on the boat? The kids could play. And it was just a fun time and a good time, and they learned a lot about God. The verses continue. When Jesus finished speaking, he said to Simon, "Take your boat into deeper water. If you will put your nets into the water, you will catch some fish." Simon answered, "Master, we worked hard all night trying to catch fish, but we caught nothing. But you say to put the nets in the water, so I will." The fishermen did as Jesus told them, and they caught so many fish that the nets were beginning to break. They called friends to come from another boat to help them. The friends came, and both boats were filled so full that they were almost sinking. This is the second miracle that Simon Peter saw. The fishermen were amazed at how many fish they caught. When Simon Peter saw what had happened, he bowed down before Jesus and said, "Go away from me, Lord. I am a sinful man." That verse is very important. We'll talk about it in just a little bit. James and John, the sons of Zebedee, were amazed too. Remember, James and John were partners of Simon and Andrew. Jesus said to Simon, "Don't be afraid. From now on, you will be fishermen for men." When the men brought their boats to the shore, they left everything and followed Jesus. I love what happened when Simon Peter saw the power of Jesus. It said, Simon Peter saw what had happened. He bowed down before Jesus and said, "Go away from me, Lord. I am a sinful man." I love the verse. To me, it is Peter who saw the power of Jesus and said, "Well, I'm not worthy, Jesus. Leave me and go find someone who is better than I am." See, that's it. Jesus doesn't want someone better. He wants us. He knows what we have, and he knows the talents we have, and he knows what we can do to help him. Peter did not say, "Hey, Jesus, we'll make a great team. I can preach to them, and then I will stand up in front of a house of worship with a Bible in my hand and say, 'If you don't do as I say, I will bring my great army down on you. They will destroy you.'" No, that's not the message Jesus brought. Remember, Jesus brought the message of love, and these are the people he chose to spread his word. Isn't it beautiful that Simon Peter saw that he wasn't worthy of God? Well, we aren't worthy of his love and grace either. You can't buy it. You can't work to gain it. We only have God's love because he gives it freely. It's up to us to accept it. We don't show God's love to other people to earn God's love. We show his love because he first gave it to us. Jesus saw something in Peter too. Jesus saw a man that was humble. Jesus saw a potential loyal follower who could carry the message of God to all nations. All four of the men followed Jesus because they knew Jesus was preaching the truth. That is why they followed him. And Simon Peter, well, he just kept making mistakes all the time he was with Jesus. Jesus forgave him each time. To me, Simon Peter represents all of us that continue to learn about Jesus. I know I keep making mistakes, and I'm just so thankful that Jesus continues to forgive me and allows me to learn more and more about him. I hope you have a fantastic week. Me, I'm going to go visit my kid in North Carolina. They've moved to a new house, and I'm anxious to see it. Now, I want you all to remember, Miss Martha has been working hard. Remember to tell her what a good job she's doing, because she is. Throw her an extra hug when you see her next week. Have a great week, and we'll talk to you later.